Today's presentation will be given by one of our postdoctoral fellows this year, Jeffery Javed. Dr. Javed is a PhD graduate of Harvard University in the Department of Government, and he received his BA in Sociology and East Asian Studies from Cornell in 2009. His research focuses on the intersection of social mobilization and political violence, with a secondary focus on the moral governance and memory politics. And his book project explores this process by which the nascent Chinese state mobilized popular participation in state repression during the mass campaigns of the early 1950s. So today he'll be speaking on moralizing the revolution, morality, mobilization, and violence in the early Maoist period. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Mary, and thank you to the LRCCS staff for all of their hard work putting this event together. So I'm delighted to be here today to present part of my book project, as Mary described quite well and comprehensively, on morality, mobilization, and violence in the early 1950s. So the project is motivated by two questions, one general theoretical and one more specific. Generally speaking, I'm interested in how states mobilize popular participation in collective violence. And I look specifically at the case of the early 1950s. I ask, how did the Chinese Communist Party mobilize widespread participation in quote-unquote class violence after the 1949 revolution? I focus mostly on the land reform campaign of the early 1950s. It lasted from 1950 to 1952. And it's actually one of the largest examples of mass mobilized violence in history. Also happens to be one of the largest examples of land redistribution, property redistribution in history. But this, unlike land reform in many parts of the world, this was extraordinarily violent. Somewhere between 1 to 5 million people were killed in the name of class struggle, many of them so-called landlords. Most of this violence was conducted at public meetings known as struggle sessions. Here we have two pictures of struggle sessions. The one on the left here is from Shanxi, and the one on the right is actually a candid photo taken in Shanghai province, which is now the Minhang district south of Shanghai. This was actually in the local county history. You see in both of these pictures this staging of violence. So there would be a stage or a clearing in which a struggle target would be paraded onto or brought onto, usually bound in ropes, to be denounced, to have bitterness spoken against them by fellow members of the community. Here we see a woman speaking bitterness against a landlord. The crowd would not just watch this spectacle of violence, they would also be encouraged to participate in a number of ways. They could shout out slogans, they could call for violence, and they could actually vote, if you can call it voting, on what would happen to the person being struggled against. The cadres on stage would ask the audience what they think should be done to this person. And they might actually even directly participate in this violence. They might rush the stage and begin beating the person under struggle. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to go over the puzzle and argument that I'm going to present today from one of the chapters in the book, the empirical strategy for the book project, and then more specifically, the Jiangnan case study. I'll talk a little bit about my comparative analysis that looks at whether or not the Chinese Communist Party's mobilization strategy actually worked. And I'll end with a few implications for the post-Maoist period. So for me, the main puzzle here is how the party turned class into a relevant participation identity, when many scholars have argued that class was not really a salient boundary along which villagers traditionally organized. Oh dear. Okay. This is actually, but the official party narrative is that, in fact, they did sort of mobilize along class boundaries, that they simply tapped into existing class hatred in order to mobilize the peasantry to violence. One top official described it as a law of physics, that people who had been oppressed for thousands of years simply needed to be unleashed, and that the party was really there to kind of let the masses kind of go at it. The problem with this argument is that there's very little evidence of it. Many scholars have noted that there's little evidence of pre-49 class-based collective action. Sociologists have noted that many peasants saw paying their rents and taxes as a moral duty, and that they needed to be convinced that the status quo was not right and proper. So my argument is that the CCP mobilized participation in collective violence by constructing new class boundaries that were laden with moral meaning, that could be used to elicit outrage against perceived moral transgressors and empathy for their alleged victims. This is a process that I call moral mobilization, which I see as a sequence of two mechanisms. First, it begins with a period of moral boundary work, or the leveraging of norms of correct and improper behavior to delineate new symbolic boundaries that separate victims, in this case the masses, from the depraved, the landed elite. And then on the basis of these boundaries, the party dramatized and performed these perceived normative violations to generate moral outrage against violators, to spur the masses to action. So in the book, I'm only going to be presenting part of this, but the overall book project looks at the provinces of Anhui and Jiangsu in central eastern China, which was under the jurisdiction of the East China Bureau. Back in the early 50s, China was divided into these 6 military administrative regions. Jiangsu and Anhui were part of the same one. And what I find interesting about these two provinces is that they happen to be cut into by the Huai River into the northern poorer region of Huaibei and the wealthier, more unequal, lineage-heavy Jiangnan region, the lower Yangtze Delta. And so I wanted to exploit this variation in geographic, in regional political economy to get at how the party is constructing class in different ways in different parts of China, while under the same central policy guidance. And so I do this by looking at archives from 6 government archives, about 200 individual documents, which I supplement with about 2,000 pages of internal party materials, which were published in the early 1950s, many of which you can actually purchase from old booksellers. And a number of oral histories and memoirs, as well as a data set that I've constructed from 127 county gazetteers taken exclusively from Anhui and Jiangsu. I also do draw on qualitative evidence from these gazetteers, which have at times some detailed historical data. So I use the case of Jiangnan as one of my chapters, in which I argue that the party is drawing on local norms of propriety to delineate between victims and oppressors, and to elicit empathy for the former and outrage toward the latter. And I define norms of propriety as norms regarding fairness, honesty, and the proper ways in which landlords and tenants should treat one another. Jiangnan is, to give you a few examples, this really was conceived in terms of landlord abuse, extracting more rent than due, or during harvest, withholding relief grain, or refusing to pay or feed your workers. So I focus on the Jiangnan region because I see it as a least likely case. This is one of the wealthiest, most unequal parts of China, where, and also a hotbed of rent resistance in the 1930s, one of the few areas of China that in fact had a great deal of landlord-tenant conflict over rents. And so we could imagine that it's a most likely case for traditional class conflict, that the party could simply be drumming up resentment over differentials in wealth, status, success. and be a least likely case, I think, for this more, this rather intensive process of kind of exploiting moral norms in order to generate hatred towards the landlord class based on their transgressions of, as I said, these norms of propriety about abuse and fairness. So I use in this chapter systematic process analysis, which is a form of process tracing, to go through each of the three stages of the land reform campaign to show why I think moral mobilization is a good explanation for what the party did. And so the land reform campaign, it was written down in policy documents. In actuality, the mobilization of violence was somewhat a mixture of both written and unwritten rules. And I condense it to these three stages. The preparatory stage, in which cadres are investigating local conditions and propagandizing its policies to the masses. A period of target selection in which they're working with local members of the community to distribute class labels, as well as designate who's going to be subjected to political struggle. And this was capped off with these mass rallies, these struggle sessions, public sentencings, people's courts in which the violence was actually being carried out. Now, the violence sometimes actually fell earlier than that, more around the target selection stage, but generally this is what the mobilization of violence, the process behind the mobilization of violence looked like. So I'm going to begin with the preparatory work stage and talk about why I think a class struggle expectation doesn't quite hold up. So if a class struggle argument would expect the cadres to be entering these areas, finding clear class divisions, high class consciousness, and on the basis of that drawing these class socioeconomic boundaries, versus a moral mobilization perspective that would have found unclear class divisions, low class consciousness, and would have focused instead on designating transgressors and victims. So the party really did actually expect that the class struggle perspective to hold up. The party insisted that Jiangnan was home to the most wily landlords of China. They quickly found out that, in fact, that was very difficult to figure out, that, in fact, local class relations were extremely complicated, and that locals also found these local class relations to be extremely complicated, that peasants often didn't know landlords, many of whom actually lived in the cities, and that they weren't particularly conscious of their oppression. In one county where I did some oral history work, Jiading County, where landlords had 20 times more land than poor peasants, a former land reform cadre mentioned that she participated in the movement mainly because most other people weren't politically active, their awareness was low, but because she was literate. And the party was actually very interested in getting her to join because of that. But she noted that no one else seemed particularly interested in joining the campaign. She did note, though, that landlord-tenant relations were guided by certain unspoken norms, that it was only right and proper to provide your tenants and workers food to eat and to treat them well. So were they actually carrying out socioeconomic or moral boundary work? Well, I find that they did both. As many of you know, the party did, in fact, draw socioeconomic boundaries on the basis of land holding size, sources of income, etc., which were known as class labels, divided society into landlords through farm workers. What is important to note here, though, is when we look at the distribution of class labels according to measures of inequality and agricultural production, that the party, in fact, was over-labeling households as landlords and rich peasants in areas that were poorer and more equal. So to explain these graphs here, on the left-hand side, we have landholding inequality on the x-axis here, and then landlord, don't know why I'm pointing at that screen. Landlord households on the left here, bad class labels on the left here. Bad class labels referring to rich peasants, landlords, landlord equivalents. And we're noticing that there's a negative relationship between landholding inequality and how many people are being labeled as landlords or given bad class labels. And that the same is holding true for agricultural productivity, a measure of how productive the soil is. And this is because the party was actually drawing these boundaries because they were very concerned with having enough land to pass around. They were very concerned about being able to fulfill the locals' demands for redistribution, for economic redistribution. And so the boundaries themselves, as I find, don't actually predict the violence that they mobilize. Rather, there was this separate process of moral boundary work that drew boundaries between victims and oppressors, and it was these boundaries that were used to mobilize violence. And so what did this boundary work look like? It involved collecting a vast amount of material on landlord wrongdoings. One Southern Jiangsu Regional Party Committee report ordered local cadres to collect copious information on the historical crimes of the landlord class. And one county reported that they very effectively educated the masses by exposing the landlord's schemes and tricks. An example of what some of these transgressions would look like in Qimen County in southern Anhui, the work team reported an example of an abusive landlord who beat a peasant for not carrying his sedan chair and for flipping a table of food and wine at another peasant's daughter's wedding. I have no clue what the background is to this. It was just apparently he was unhappy that his tenant was having a lavish wedding for his daughter. But a very, as you can see here, very much a transgression centered around this idea of landlord abuse. So this boundary work is being carried out over a period of weeks, if not months, in small groups known as informal chats, where they would, for hours, go over, cadres would work with poor peasants to review all of this evidence that they had collected, and to encourage them to share their grievances, to engage in speaking bitterness. And part of the goal for this was to elicit empathy between the peasants for one another, especially for those who were speaking about their troubles, who became known as the aggrieved, literally the masters of bitterness. A strategy here for arousing empathy was actually communal crying. You see in some reports the measuring the efficacy of an informal chat or small group meeting based on the number of people they were able to get to cry. This process also involved assigning blame. Of course, there has to be an oppressor. There has to be someone to blame for this. And this was known as digging up the root of bitterness. And of course, the answer was almost always a local landlord or perhaps a local power holder. This didn't necessarily map nicely onto class lines, but the narrative had to have both a victim and an oppressor. And I argue that this boundary work is a way of creating a participation identity by empowering the victimized to act, to help the poor peasants see themselves as victims, and on the basis of this victim identity, to participate with the Communist Party in mass violence. And an interesting phrase that you hear repeated again and again in these documents is helping the peasants acquire a mentality of becoming the new masters or the masters of their own fate. That these meetings were very much about not just sharing grievances, but convincing the masses that they were in charge and that they, though victimized before, now had the power to act. It's always hard to judge the efficacy of this at the individual level. Inspection teams often recorded testimonies after preparatory meetings, often in both directions, positive and negative. But it's interesting to see how these testimonies are worded. One fellow in Shanghai noted that 2 months of land reform class had clarified his 30-years-old way of thinking and had made him capable of distinguishing between right and wrong. Not making him hate the landlords because he was poor and they were rich, but understanding what is proper, what was not, what is just and what is unjust. In an oral history, I found the reverse. One local talking about how she felt that the landlords did not bully or use violence against them, but saying the landlords were good was a bit of a problem because the party was saying that they're bad, so she couldn't say that they were good. Obviously, this mixture of responses it's difficult to get a full distribution of how many people necessarily were convinced by this moral boundary work, but we do see a distribution of both positive and negative responses in the party literature. So, on the basis of these boundaries, cadres and poor peasants work together to select actual targets for political violence. Now, what's puzzling here is that if we look at the number of targets selected for political struggle as a percentage of the number of landlords labeled in a region, we notice that only about 10% of local landlords would have been struggled against on average, assuming that every single person struggled against was defined as an economic landlord, which is not true. So this is a very targeted campaign of violence, and so it behooves us to understand how exactly are these people being selected and what is being done to mobilize violence against them. I find that that communities are choosing targets based on the crimes that they've committed, not necessarily their class status. One prefecture report ordered cadres to realize that the current landlords should not necessarily be targeted because they've not held power for very long and have not had enough time to commit all kinds of crimes. Essentially, just because someone's rich today doesn't necessarily mean that they should be selected for political struggle, because the person who was rich 5-10 years ago probably has a more sordid past with locals that could be exploited. This process really tried to find people who could be labeled as evil tyrants, who were guilty of the most heinous crimes. This phrase, 罪大恶极, comes up in the literature so often when describing people who are being selected for political struggle. And I don't show this data here, but if we look at execution and imprisonment data, nearly 100% of evil tyrants were executed. And there's very much differential punishment based on whether or not you were labeled someone guilty of the most heinous crimes or not. So there was also a clear focus on selecting the bad ones. In one oral history respondent told me that it was usually landlords and bad people who were put on stage to be struggled against, as long as those who had bad tempers and liked to scold locals and cadres. Another report noted that the citizens were using the people's court to send whoever they deemed was bad to endure popular justice. And quite notably, party documents noted both in policy and in actuality that they spared widows, orphans, and any enlightened gentry who may have been economically landlords, but were relatively sympathetic figures. And now, enlightened gentry was a term used to describe communist sympathizers, people who had joined the party or were pro-CCP before the communists arrived. And so if you were a landlord and you were deemed to be good or a member of the enlightened gentry, you could actually participate in violence against people who were of the same class but deemed to be a bad person. So this is a lot of text. This is giving you an example of what a list of struggle targets would look like. This is a list of struggle targets from 3 townships from southern Jiangsu. I want you to note 3 things. One, that their behavior is being described literally as evil deeds and recorded in quite a bit of detail. And that out of the 14 people listed here, I think 11 of them have evil deeds that were described in particularly moral emotional terms. They're being accused of murder, rape, this one woman of stirring up trouble between husbands and wives, stealing property, or this very kind of vague term that you sometimes see, consistently engaging in bad behavior. The last thing to note is that not a substantial proportion, about like 1/3, 1/4 of the people here are actually not even labeled as landlords. Regardless of whether or not the people labeled here as landlords actually were wealthy, it's shocking that people who were just outright not labeled as landlords were being put up for political struggle, being labeled things such as vagrant or managerial landlord, essentially a rent collector. That the party was actually liberal enough about using about the mismatch between class labels and violence that it didn't necessarily have qualms about struggling against people who were explicitly not labeled as bad classes. I look at this more in detail in the chapter here. I do a full case study on Balshan County, but this is some data from a list of struggle targets across 3 districts in Balshan, and I note a similar pattern here that over half of the struggle targets had their offenses described in overtly moral terms, especially dishonest, sly, obstinate, engaging in bad behavior. Those of you who were here last week for Thomas Bowie's talk might notice that there's an amazing similarity between the language used here and the language used in Qing law to describe these bear sticks, these people who were not supposed to be given any sort of leniency or pardon in the criminal justice system. So they're using the similar language, but an important thing to note here is if we look at the distribution of land of these struggle targets, that most of them have a fair amount of land, well over 50 mu of land, which was enough to classify you as a landlord. But ultimately, the mean there is kind of between what was considered a rich peasant and a landlord, and more importantly, the distribution is quite large. And I talk about this in detail elsewhere, but if we actually were to analyze the correlation between land and the kind of punishment you were given, there's no correlation. There is, however, a correlation according to whether or not you were described in overly moral terms and the violence that was used against you. So now we've arrived at struggle sessions, the kind of capstone experience of the land reform movement. And again, a kind of class struggle perspective would be would note that here we would be seeing all of this kind of focus on the unjustness of inequality and kind of dramatizing resentment about some people having more than others, or economically exploiting other local members of the community. But in fact, we see a dramatization of normative violations. Accusers, people who were speaking bitterness, were actually coached on how to deliver their stories in the most effective and dramatic way possible. These classes really resembled almost acting classes. They were told how to condense their story so that it wasn't particularly long or rambling, how to get to the most bitter parts first, and how to give it in a way that would most likely elicit empathy and, by extension, outrage against the person they were struggling against. A regional party report ordered cadres to find the the more vivid, concrete, and detailed the evidence, the better. To find very, very kind of flashy evidence that could be used at these struggle sessions. In this example I give here, a mother and father brought out the bones of their son who was allegedly killed by a spy. It was not uncommon for people to bring out hair, body parts of people who had been allegedly killed by others, to show physical scars, to present bloody clothing, perhaps even, let's say, weapons that were used to beat people. And what I think is particularly interesting here is that the accusers and their targets were actually sequenced according to the perceived egregiousness of their transgressions to heighten the mobilizing power of these moral theatrics. A Fengxian County report noted that they first struggled against the power-holding clique of evil tyrants before turning to lesser evil tyrants, and that this had raised the fighting spirit of the masses. Often see if people are being struggled against at the beginning of the land reform campaign, they often are evil tyrants, and they're then put alongside people who are accused of less overtly moral crimes, such as perhaps hiding your land deed or hiding land from the party, trying to sabotage the campaign. And so there's this interesting sequence of more overtly moral offenders, and then as you go along through the campaign, fewer and fewer overtly moral offenders and more kind of anti-party elements whom were probably not going to be easy to mobilize against were they selected to kick off a campaign of mass violence. And so this dramatization often led to moral outrage and violence. One of the examples from that chart, that table I showed you, of this woman who was accused of being morally loose and sowing discord among husbands and wives and selling women, they actually mobilized a majority of the they mobilized women in particular to come to this struggle session. 2/3 of the people at the struggle session were women. They were quite meticulous about ensuring that their audience was precisely that the violence was speaking to the correct audience. And after 22 people denouncing her, the crowd was reported to have been unusually outraged, and that the female participants in particular seemed to have been very moved by the event. In another example, this evil tyrant had 50 people lined up to speak bitterness against him, but because the accusers themselves had gotten so angry and started beating him soon after the session began, he had already been beaten to death after only 2 people finished their accusations. And so this was not encouraged, but it was allowed. Again, this was a way of the party showing itself as the kind of deliverer of justice. They're delivering justice for the people. They're not necessarily telling people to go and beat others to death, but they're creating the conditions for it. Cadres were not allowed to directly beat struggle targets themselves. If they were caught doing so, they were disciplined for it. But accusers, very understandably, would get so angry while in a face-to-face interaction with the person that they feel aggrieved them. And after months of this moral boundary work, convincing locals that they were face-to-face with someone who was evil and deserved to be punished, it's not too surprising that violence often broke out. So I do a little bit of a comparative analysis to understand whether or not moral mobilization actually works. So I've shown you that the party's using this strategy. It's another question if it was efficacious. So here I'm going to present a short comparison of a successful and failed case of mobilization in the Jiangnan region. I do a most similar design between Wuxi and Taicang counties, which are very close to one another in southern Jiangsu. You'll notice here that they're similar on most indicators, from inequality, productivity. The party members, according to like the larger distribution of party members, they both have very, very low densities of party members, though obviously Wuxi has multiple times fewer party members than Taicang. About the same number of percentage of people being labeled as bad classes occupied by the Japanese. But it was noted that the cadres in Taicang were not very well trained, and the ones in Wuxi were in fact more experienced and well trained because they had carried out land reform elsewhere before arriving in Wuxi. And we see a certain amount of variation in the amount of violence that each county mobilized. That Wuxi mobilized a fair amount of more violence than Taicang. So why was this? Well, Wuxi wasn't a place that was particularly easy to mobilize in. The cadres who worked there argued that the crafty feudal mode of rule had confused the class consciousness of the masses. As we saw elsewhere, the peasants did not have much class consciousness. This was blamed, of course, on feudal rule, but the peasants were apprehensive and needed to be convinced that the status quo was something worth questioning. And so they noted that they did informal chats, they visited people in their homes to talk to them, and they focused on a minority of landlords whom the peasants hated or could be convinced to hate. They noted that most landlords were actually not particularly cared about. People didn't necessarily have feelings about them either way, but there were some people that they could work with. And so these were the people whom they used to carry out political struggle. In Taicang, however, we see the opposite. Taicang was admonished for its poor cadre discipline and training. The cadres were accused of not being patient enough with locals in carrying out their work, and at times for just not even carrying out any mobilization work. That they were not holding meetings, they were poorly attended. I think they argued that only about 50% of locals were even given any sort of class education. And so when they talked to locals, the locals told the inspectors that, well, this isn't right. The landlord's land is passed down from their ancestors. Now you've divided their land and want us to struggle against them. Frankly, it's just too much. So we see here the preservation of a moral distinction that upholds the status quo that the communists were trying to break, but were not able to break because they did not have the organizational capacity to do so. Cadres were also accused of crude implementation in the moral theatrics that they employed. I say here no moral theatrics. I should say it was more kind of backfired moral theatrics. This is a very revealing example. Women ran away in tears when they saw a female landlord being unjustly struggled against. One of them said, "Landlord Cao was very friendly to people and barely received anything in rent. To struggle against her was really wrong." Now compare this to the other instance that I gave you, where we have 2/3 of the audience being women who were very moved and outraged by this struggle target who was accused of essentially breaking up relationships and selling women into slavery. So I do talk a little bit about implications for post-Mao China, how moral mobilization, I think, how it appears in later periods. I'm going to go over that very briefly here. I argue that moral mobilization was a strategy used to shore up the legitimacy of the party and reorient its moral boundaries during perceived legitimacy crises. So the two periods in which I see moral mobilization being used after 1978 is during the Strike Hard campaign at the beginning of the Reform era and the anti-corruption campaign of today. So the Strike Hard campaign was a campaign that supposedly targeted criminals, often criminals who had been accused of very sensationalized crimes such as murder, rape, etc. And they were punished at mass rallies. They were given public sentencings, and that these rallies were held in ways that were recognized to be similar to those of the 1950s. Ralph Thaxton has a very interesting description of how this violence was being carried out. He writes that officials stoked public indignation towards accused criminals who were paraded through the streets with derogatory signs around their necks, while scores of police cars, sirens screaming, were dispatched to seize criminals reported by the masses. So Thaxton, in his book, actually argues that this was not particularly effective in the countryside, but he argues that it was effective in the cities where the Strike Hard campaign was very much focused because it focused on these moral theatrics. While in the area that he studied in the countryside, local cadres were so corrupt that they were really just kind of carrying out violence against their own enemies and not necessarily people who were real or perceived threats to the political order. Today, in the anti-corruption campaign, we see a lot of similarities. So many of you might recognize this fellow here. One of the stars of the popular TV show In the People's Name, 人民的名义, which focuses on corruption and kind of catching and punishing delinquent officials. The campaign, the show itself is very morally theatrical. You should watch it if you haven't. But the campaign itself is as well. If we look at how corruption is framed today, it's often a drawing on very sort of flashy sort of moral transgressions. People like Zhou Yongkang were accused of using money that they had stolen for sex, for having mistresses. Almost always gets appended to people's crimes. Sex, mistresses, drug use, gambling, etc. And I've only done some preliminary research here, but if we look at some of these corruption inspection guidelines that have been produced for investigators, we see some interesting similarities between the 50s and today. This one Preparatory handbook notes that orders the cadres to go into the masses to collect evidence and to really try to find evidence that is being provided by the people, not necessarily things that you've just found by yourself. But I thought this was particularly interesting that when collecting info on people, to collect details on their hobbies and their personality characteristics, which you can't help but think has to do with the way in which they're going to frame them when they're caught when they're actually sentenced for corruption. I also am looking at the Cultural Revolution and the links between the 50s and Cultural Revolution violence. And I'm working on an experiment that examines the role of moral outrage in the anti-corruption campaign and also its applicability to the American context. And that's it. Thank you. I look forward to your feedback.
So I found it really compelling the way you showed us that I found it really compelling the way you showed us that moral outrage ultimately became a very important tool for mobilizing class violence, or what was framed as class violence in these situations. And a lot of your evidence showed that the actual attacks were focused more on people who had bad behavior that people hated, as opposed to their ownership of land and their class status. So I guess I'm curious, because we know that these campaigns, like you said, they would start out with the one that could elicit the most violence, but then ultimately they would attack others as well. So I'm curious, if you look ultimately at the land that was distributed, if you can see these as a way to mobilize class violence that maybe were overly targeted at these hated people, but whether or not the ultimate effect of distributing land actually did distribute land from the people who were, in terms of class status, were actually the largest landholders.
Okay, yeah, so I find that there is evidence that they are confiscating land based on actual land holdings because they're actually concerned about having enough to give people. If they don't have enough, they'll get in a lot of trouble. What's interesting is that in poor areas, you see cadres complaining that the rich people aren't rich enough, that these areas that in Huaibei that are poor and the land quality is low, that in fact we need to label more people as landlords or rich peasants, and perhaps even start digging deeper into that distribution of class labels, which is very dangerous because that starts scaring the community that anyone could be targeted. But you do see that. I simply argue that the economic incentives weren't as important as the moral incentives for mobilizing violence.
I was wondering if you, during your research, whether you came across some incidences where the so-called 公报私仇, where you use your public opportunity to vent your private grievance, you know.
Yes, 公报私仇 was criticized heavily by the party, that you wanted to avoid it. Of course it happened. It's inevitable in any campaign of violence. Revenge becomes a very important kind of motive. People, you know, the Gestapo complained that you had Germans trying to turn in their wives and husbands because they didn't like them for being like anti-Nazi when they actually weren't. Soviet secret police having similar complaints. It seems like when the state is mobilizing violence, plenty of people try to take advantage of it to get rid of relatives, in-laws, etc., which is kind of scary. There was a prohibition on explicitly using revenge because it was seen as something that couldn't necessarily mobilize the whole community. It could possibly fracture the community if you took this, this lineage versus that lineage. If you were unequally struggling against one or the other, the community wouldn't be mobilized as poor peasants or as poor peasants through middle peasants. They'd be mobilized more along these factional lines, and that they thought would inhibit further political mobilization.
Do you have any information on actual murder rates before and after one of these campaigns?
Oh, like baseline murder rates? I don't actually. That would be very interesting data to have, though. I try to measure for pre-49 violence, looking at these 械斗, these kind of community fights between between different villages or groups of villagers. I don't find a relationship between areas that had more intercommunal conflict and violence, but then again, the data is not great.
Find out death rates?
Death rates? I mean, I don't record the data, but it's there. Yeah.
When your presentation started, I could see in the 50s, in the early 50s, the techniques that were used to bring about social change. And it reminded me of a friend of mine in China whose father in the Cultural Revolution had some of the same things happen to him that happened to those landlords back in the 50s. And then you say, now we've got the anti-corruption. Are you tracing a kind of thread of this that goes through China from the revolution to now?
Sort of. The Cultural Revolution I see almost as a kind of. I do see it as qualitatively different. I see there to be more of a similarity between the 50s, the 80s, and now than between the 50s and the Cultural Revolution, which may sound odd, but it's because the techniques were definitely the same. But at that point, those moral boundaries had been set. Economic differences weren't the basis of anything. At this point, it became at that point, the kind of link between your actual behavioral goodness and your people's propensity to use violence against you just doesn't seem to be there. At that point, I almost feel like, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but at that point, class had almost been like ethnicized, I feel like. It had become an ascriptive identity because you could inherit it. And so at that point, I felt like you were seeing group conflict that was almost devoid of that kind of morality that you see here. There didn't need to be a moral reasoning. At that point, it could just be these like kind of arbitrary factional reasons. At least that's my current take.
But since I have the microphone, I'm going to ask a question. I have a question about the focus on class as the cleavage that's hard to mobilize people around versus an argument that is more about the need for moral outrage in China in particular. So are you saying, do you think that it's that class in particular is a hard social cleavage to get people mobilized around for various reasons, like you were mentioning earlier, or is it because in China in particular, it's important to have moral outrage attached to any kind of political mobilization?
Yes, I think this process is somewhat generalizable. I mean, in Europe, there is some interesting work in Europe, I think, like Roger Gould's work on the Paris Commune and then before that the 1848 revolution, which he sees as class not being particularly relevant in the commune period, but more relevant in 1848. That the boundary that was more relevant at that point was neighborhoods, and that it didn't seem like mobilizing people along the lines of workers was going to be as effective. I feel like there's research showing that certain participation identities are easier to mobilize around, but I don't think a clear explanation of how political actors figure that out or how they could possibly manipulate them. But I think it could work outside of China. I wouldn't say that class is always difficult, but I'd have to investigate that further.
So first, Letty, and then could you pass it over?
Thank you for a talk. If you said the government encouraged people to use violence against their landlords, they were mobilized, approved to use violence, and then I was wondering how the party just was in control of social order if that mass violence led to a social chaos.
Yes. So this is an argument that I have a hard time selling, and so I don't really make it much anymore. But the party actually did try to restrain violence, and we actually see a negative relationship between party density and the amount of violence mobilized, which people think is super weird. But if you look at documents, they're very worried about this. They're very worried about it just spiraling out of control and then anyone feeling that they could be victimized. And as soon as that happens, you have mass panic. And that's not the goal. The goal is to mobilize. Mao once said in a private letter that, you know, in the campaign to suppress counterrevolutionaries, that the goal was to kill as many people that the masses wanted killed so they would be happy, and then to stop. So there's this very weird balancing act about using violence, mobilizing violence, enough violence that could get people politicized, but then trying to stop. But yes, they lost control often.
Hi. I was just wondering if you could say what you have in mind and when you talk about the implications for the American context.
So this is actually a project I'm working on with Blake, who I don't think is here.
I think you ran out as soon as
So we're actually working on a project that is partly experimental, partly correlational, that's using machine learning algorithms to scrape comments from extremist websites such as Breitbart. And we're looking at whether or not there's a correlation between the sort of moral emotional content of these articles and calls for violence in the comments, hate speech calls for violence. And we've been coding the articles by hand. Very, very interesting stuff. You know, at times you don't even know how to code some of these comments because they're just so bizarre. But it's frightening, some of the stuff that's out there. And it's hard not to see this as being elicited. You know, there are actually real life examples. I mean, many of you can think, for example, something like Pizzagate, in which a conspiracy theory had become so enraging that some people actually would take a gun and go to the place to, you know, seek justice. So I do think in the information age, in fake news, we do see a similarity there.
I have a question about the case selection and the relationship between the class struggle and the moral mobilization. So I was convinced that the Jiangnan is the most likely case for the class struggle, but I was not sure why it is the least likely case for moral mobilization. So is it the fact that Jiangnan is the most likely case for the class struggle that makes Jiangnan as the least likely case for the moral mobilization, or is there any kind of unique indicator that shows that Jiangnan is the least likely case for moral mobilization? I think I'm asking this because I think the fact that the likelihood of class conflict is more likely does not necessarily make the cases as least likely case for the moral mobilization. Maybe they can happen at the same time. So I just wanted to hear about that.
Yes, so this is something I struggle with, because if you look at like the literature on crucial cases, critical cases, I actually find this confusing, really, you know, because some of these methodologists argue that a most likely case is least likely for everything else and the reverse. And so if if it's most likely for your alternative arguments, then it's probably least likely for your own. But like I agree with you. That doesn't necessarily follow. Which I actually am thinking about changing that language because I think it's a little. I think it's a bit extreme. There is. Jiangnan is also a most likely case for kind of traditional collective action perspectives. If you think about kind of giving people economic resources as a way to mobilize them, that you had a bigger pie to kind of skim off of, and we don't really see much of that there. So I also do look at that as another reason why we shouldn't see moral mobilization, mainly because it's a lot of work. This took a lot of work, and it's a very costly thing to do if you don't have to do it. But I agree, it's perhaps not the best to call it a least likely, most likely case.
This thing about where you can mobilize people, it's sort of like the fish doesn't recognize water. I mean, if you live in a time when there's a divine right of kings, well, that's what the right is, and going against it is wrong. And if you're convinced that the way you have a just title for land that your ancestors gave it to you, you're not going to see that as a proper class struggle, whereas if the person's agreeing, that will be a proper class struggle. So I'm not that surprised by your data that there were a level holdings in the land that people thought there ought to be level holdings in the land, and so they objected when there was a difference from that, whereas possibly in areas where some people inherited a lot, well, that was the way it was, and people weren't that upset about it.
Oh, I see. Kind of like almost. I don't know if this is the right term. Almost like land mobility. That I mean, in the north in Huaibei, you did have a lot of land swapping. The ownership was changing quite rapidly, and so. But at the same time, that does mean that class is more fluid, and you do definitely see evidence that class is not particularly felt because a lot of people own land.
Well, we can change. The other thing I just mentioned in passing is that in areas where there's not enough productivity from the land to make it worth having slaves, there aren't slaves. You get your peasant yeoman, and where there's enough productivity of the land that you can generate a considerable surplus, you will get your slavery.
Yeah.
You will get your misbehaving people who are getting more than their share.
Yeah. Yeah, so I completely agree with that. I mean, I'm only showing, I'm only really focusing on the Jiangnan case here, but I do use Huaibei to show that when you're looking at a context that's completely different, where the landlord-tenant relationship isn't as important in Huaibei as it is in Jiangnan, that they're focusing on different norms, that they're actually looking more at corruption and abuse by officials, many of whom aren't landlords. So it's more like people who are perhaps equally poor as you, but they collected rent. They perhaps conscripted you forcibly into the army. They, perhaps threw your son in jail. So these are the people. So that division, this kind of like care-harm division, I see as more important there, precisely because, it's a more, it's the relevant social relationship there.
So I think we have time for at least one.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And you probably think I'm going to ask a question about theater, but I'm not. I was interested in your comment about the one informant who talked about her literacy mattering. And so I'm curious about the correlation between educational campaigns and moral mobilization, and whether there is a positive correlation in terms of the cognitive work of teaching about what class means in Marxist-Leninist framework was happening at a high rate in the same places that moral mobilization is happening, or whether this is a substitute for example, in places where educational campaigns and literacy campaigns maybe aren't succeeding as much. I was curious if you've looked at that at all.
Well, that's very interesting. I would argue that they're fused. If we look, for example, in some areas of Huaibei, we see cadres being ordered to work with local teachers to produce propaganda material that can be consumed easily by people who have very low rates of literacy. They're being encouraged to use cartoons of landlord abuse or just in general abuse of locals. And that was being done to certainly inculcate class consciousness and to educate them about class, but it's also being used to elicit outrage. And so there's, I think, there's this intertwining of education and violent mobilization. Intriguingly, the party itself in the 50s claimed that it was carrying out education and was very defensive that people were calling it, I guess, 挑拨离间, like stirring things up. They weren't stirring things up, they were just educating people, was their argument. And so there's this interesting intertwining of mobilization and education here.
I'm going to stop us, it's almost quarter of, but thanks for the great talk.
Oh, thank you.